Gen Z is broke. And I mean structurally, systemically, historically broke. The kind of broke where you graduate college, land a job, and still can't afford both rent and groceries in the same week. Broke enough that economists are seriously calling them the unluckiest generation in modern history. Think about it. Boomers bought homes for the price of a used Honda. Gen X at least got in before housing turned into a Hunger Games arena. Millennials stretched, cried, and still maybe squeezed into a starter condo. Gen Z? They're locked out of the game entirely, watching Zillow like it's a fantasy football draft they'll never join. And the numbers back it up. The US Census Bureau says half of renters under 30 spend over 30% of their income on housing.
Rental prices are unaffordable for a record number of Americans, with half of all renters paying more than 30%.
The Federal Reserve says the average Gen Z borrower is already $20,000 deep in student loans before they even land a real paycheck. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics? They're out here confirming that wages, once adjusted for inflation, basically flatlined. It's like playing Mario Kart, where every power-up is just a banana peel. Yet somehow, society still says, well, if they just stopped buying lattes and avocado toast... Right. Because a $5 oat milk latte is what's keeping you from a $500,000 mortgage. Totally checks out. This video is about showing how the economic ladder got pulled up right as Zoomers reached for it. Wages frozen, housing unattainable, debt exploding, and jobs unstable. Stick around, because we're about to break down how an entire generation became the poorest one yet, and what, if anything, they can actually do about it. Alright, let's talk paychecks, or as Gen Z calls them, vibes with direct deposit. On paper, wages have gone up. That's the headline. But when you adjust for inflation, the actual cost of living, it's a whole different story. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported in 2024 that real average hourly earnings barely moved. In fact, they grew just 0.5% year over year. That's basically a rounding error. Meanwhile, rent went up 7%, groceries 6%, and insurance premiums double digits. That means every so-called raise is basically just a coupon for ramen noodles. And this isn't new. The Economic Policy Institute has data showing that since the late 1970s, worker productivity skyrocketed, up over 60%, but wages barely budged. Translation, workers are producing way more value, but their paycheck hasn't kept pace. And who scoops up the difference? CEOs and shareholders. The average CEO to worker pay ratio used to be 20 to 1 in 1965. Now, try 344 to 1. You don't need a math degree to see who's winning that equation. As a dad, I sometimes look at my kid and wonder, will he ever get a job where his effort actually translates into income? Because for Gen Z, the link between hard work and financial stability feels broken. And here's where it gets even bleaker. A Pew Research Center analysis found that today's young adults earn less than millennials did at the same age, once adjusted for inflation. So Gen Z is starting adulthood already behind. It's like entering a marathon where the older runners got a 2-mile head start and free sneakers while you're running in Crocs. But sure, tell them to just work harder, because clearly the solution to 40 years of stagnant wage growth is hustle culture. And don't forget the side hustle explosion. Gen Z has more gig workers than any previous generation. According to Deloitte's 2024 survey, almost half of Gen Z has a side hustle. Not because it's fun or entrepreneurial, but because their main job doesn't cover the basics. Imagine explaining to your grandparents that your stable income comes from delivering Uber Eats at midnight after your 9 to 5. They'd think you lost a bet. So here's the bottom line. Wages are stagnant, costs are soaring, and the gap in between is where Gen Z's financial security goes to die. Next stop on the Gen Z poverty tour, student debt. Ah yes, the modern American rite of passage. Like a graduation cap, but with an interest rate. For decades, the advice was simple. Go to college. It's the only way to get ahead. And Gen Z listened. But the problem is, college costs exploded like a soda can in a hot car. Adjusted for inflation, tuition at public universities has more than tripled since the 1980s, and wages, as we just discussed, stayed basically flat. According to the Department of Education, total federal student loan debt sits around $1.6 trillion in 2024. That's trillion with a T, basically the GDP of Canada, except instead of universal healthcare and maple syrup, it buys you Sally Mae breathing down your neck. The Federal Reserve reported that the median student borrower owes between $20,000 and $25,000, and that's just the middle. For grad school borrowers, it's often $70,000 or more. 1 in 5 borrowers is in default or seriously delinquent within a few years of leaving school. In other words, this isn't just a bill, it's an anchor. Think about it. You're 22, diploma in hand, ready to conquer the world, and the world immediately says, cool, now fork over the equivalent of a Tesla you don't own with 6% interest. And here's the kicker. A lot of Gen Z's debt didn't even lead to stable jobs. Roughly 40% of grads end up in jobs that don't require a degree right after college, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which means many are paying champagne prices for a beer-level job market. Meanwhile, politicians keep dangling debt forgiveness like it's the McRib, here for a limited time, then gone. The Biden administration canceled about $146 billion for some borrowers, but that's less than 10% of the total debt. Helpful, yes, but to the average 23-year-old drowning in loans, it feels like being thrown a pool noodle in the middle of the Atlantic. And yet, the cultural narrative persists. Well, you shouldn't have majored in philosophy. Right. Except most Gen Z borrowers didn't. They majored in business, health sciences, or STEM. But even those don't guarantee escape from the debt trap. Now let's talk about the biggest financial horror story in Gen Z's life: housing. Rent is the villain that eats first and asks questions later. And spoiler, it's eating a lot. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, nearly half of renters in 2023 were what's called cost-burdened, meaning they spent more than 30% of their income just keeping a roof overhead. And about 1 in 4 renters were severely cost-burdened, spending over half their income on housing. Yes, half. It's like paying for a gym membership that costs so much you can't afford food. But hey, at least you'll look shredded. And forget buying. Redfin reported in 2024 that only about 26% of Gen Z adults owned homes. That's partly because they're young, sure, but also because home prices have skyrocketed out of orbit. In 1980, the median U.S. home cost about 3 times the median household income. Today, it's 7 times. Mortgage rates haven't helped either. After hovering near 3% during the pandemic, rates doubled, pushing monthly payments to record highs. For Gen Z, even with a decent salary, the down payment alone is like being told to save up for a spaceship. Older generations got in when prices were reasonable. Boomers bought in the 70s and 80s when homes were cheap and interest rates, though high, dropped later and boosted equity. Millennials stretched to buy post-2008, often taking on massive debt, but at least getting in before prices doubled again. Gen Z, they're standing outside the stadium, listening to the game through the walls. And the rental market isn't exactly offering relief. Rent in major cities like New York, Toronto, and San Francisco has risen so fast that young workers are doubling up in apartments meant for one, basically turning bedrooms into co-living experiences, which is a fancy way of saying your roommate's bed is 6 feet from yours. All right, so Gen Z got the degree. Maybe. Or maybe not. Doesn't matter, because the job market isn't exactly a fairy tale either. Gone are the days of steady 9-to-5 careers with pensions. Instead, Gen Z inherited the labor equivalent of a slot machine. Sometimes it pays out, but mostly you just watch your coins disappear. According to Pew Research, Gen Z entered the workforce during back-to-back crises: the pandemic recession of 2020, followed by the inflation spike of 2022. That double whammy left scars. Employers used COVID as an excuse to slash staff, then used inflation as an excuse not to raise wages. In other words, heads they win, tails you lose. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that nearly 40% of Gen Z workers are in part-time, contract, or gig jobs. That's Uber, DoorDash, freelance work, Or, as corporations like to brand it, flexible opportunities. Translation: no healthcare, no retirement plan, and no stability. But hey, at least you get to expense your car insurance. Working gig jobs is like being in a relationship with someone who keeps saying, "We're just keeping it casual." At some point, you want commitment, and even the so-called good jobs aren't what they used to be. Job security has evaporated. A Deloitte survey in 2024 found that nearly 50% of Gen Z worry about layoffs constantly. And honestly, with AI creeping in, they're not wrong. Goldman Sachs estimated that AI could automate 300 million jobs worldwide, which sounds cool until you realize your boss is basically testing whether ChatGPT can do your role. And guess what? Sometimes it can. In the mid-20th century, you could graduate high school, walk into a factory, and make enough to support a family. You'd get healthcare, a pension, maybe even a gold watch when you retired. But for Gen Z, the gold watch is now a free branded water bottle after a round of mass layoffs. I'm gonna be real with you. I've worked jobs that felt stable on paper, but deep down, you know you're just one reorg, one merger, or one algorithm away from getting that "we regret to inform you" email. Now, if you've stuck with me this far, you might be wondering, is Gen Z really that poor? Or are they just bad with money? You know, the "stop buying Starbucks" argument. Well, let's actually look at the numbers, because it's not the lattes. First up, inflation. Everyone's favorite invisible tax. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that from 2000 to 2023, overall prices in the US went up about 78%. But wages for young workers barely budged. That means Gen Z is paying late-stage capitalism prices with early 2000s paychecks. It's like being invited to a fancy restaurant, but you're only allowed to order from the kids' menu, and the chicken nuggets cost $30. Let's break it down. Groceries up 25% since the pandemic. Rents up more than 30% in major cities. Childcare costs have doubled since the early 2000s. And healthcare? Don't even get me started. According to KFF, the average annual premium for employer health insurance in 2023 was over $23,000 per family. That's like paying for a second mortgage, except instead of a house, you get an argument with your insurance provider. Now, the wealth gap. Here's where it gets brutal. The Federal Reserve's 2023 Survey of Consumer Finances showed that the median wealth of someone under 35 is around $39,000. Sounds okay, until you realize that people aged 55 to 64 are sitting on a median wealth of over $250,000. In other words, boomers are basically swimming in the Scrooge McDuck money vault, while Gen Z is checking their couch cushions for coins. And historically, this is new. In 1989, when boomers were the same age Gen Z is now, they controlled about 21% of the nation's wealth. Today's Gen Z, barely 4.5%. That's not a gap, that's a canyon. Meanwhile, corporate profits are booming. The top 1% now own nearly a third of all wealth in the US, and the supposed solution is to just work harder. But Gen Z already is working harder. Multiple jobs, side hustles, delayed families. The math just doesn't add up. But sure, keep telling them it's the iced coffee that's keeping them poor. If only Starbucks had a loyalty program for generational wealth. So let's call it what it is. Gen Z isn't lazy, entitled, or reckless with money. They're broke because the system is working against them. Inflation eats their paycheck. Housing locks them out of wealth. Debt strangles their future. Wages froze. Tuition tripled. Healthcare became a luxury product. Meanwhile, corporations, billionaires, and older generations got to play musical chairs with wealth. And guess who was left standing when the music stopped? That's right. Gen Z. It's like showing up to a Monopoly game where the boomers already own Boardwalk and Park Place, millennials are fighting over Baltic Avenue, and Gen Z is just praying to pass go without overdrafting their bank account. But here's the thing. Poverty is not destiny. Yes, Gen Z got dealt a rough hand, but they also have one weapon no previous generation had: information. They grew up online. They see through marketing spin, and they're not afraid to question outdated advice like, just work harder. They know the system is broken, and that awareness is power. So if you're Gen Z, don't let anyone gaslight you into thinking your financial struggles are your fault. And don't lose hope. Every generation gets told the world is ending. But you know what? The ones who adapt, who innovate, who refuse to play by rigged rules, they're the ones who change the game. Also, if you ever wondered how come housing is such a mess right now, go and watch my other video on why the housing crisis was never meant to be fixed. Trust me, once you see how deep that rabbit hole goes, you'll never look at real estate, boomers, and politicians the same way again.